July 1969, it became indeed for all mankind.
Or did they? Could it be possible that what was witnessed on 20th July 1969 on television around the globe was not true, a fake, a hoax, a total fabrication? A small group of skeptics seem to think so, and they say that they have the evidence to prove it. Is this really feasible that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and possibly some elements of the American government could really have fooled the world by pulling off the greatest hoax in history and keep the secret for almost 50 years? The NASA Apollo program, it is estimated, involved 400,000 people and was supported by more than 20,000 companies and research institutions working over a period of 8 years. If the moon landings were a hoax, then how could that many people have remained silent for so long? And the Russians, surely with their technological expertise, their well-documented espionage activities, and their desire to beat the Americans in all space-related matters, would surely have broadcast to the world that it never actually happened. We will start with a little bit of history just to make sure that we are all on the same page. During the Second World War, the Western nations, comprising the United Kingdom and its dominions, the USA, and some of the French forces, formed an alliance with the Soviet Union, the USSR, to fight Germany. However, it was a very reluctant alliance on both sides, but one of the necessary expediency if the Germans were to be defeated quickly. Following the defeat of Germany on May 1945, Europe was divided up among the free nations of the West and the Eastern nations under the control of the Soviet Union. Germany itself was divided into East and West Germany, and the capital Berlin was divided into 4 military sectors controlled respectively by Britain, the US, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany was to remain so divided in the West until 1955, when West Germany was formed, and in the East until 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed as a political entity, leading to the reunification of Germany in 1990. Remember the jubilation at the fall of the Berlin Wall? Perhaps you own a tiny souvenir piece of the wall in some forgotten drawer. After the war, US and Russia were seen to be the 2 most powerful nations on Earth, and they held diametrically opposing political ideologies. The USA followed so-called capitalist free market policies, whereas the Russians were ardent communists exercising the utmost in state control of almost every aspect of daily life of its citizens. Both saw the other as seeking some form of world domination for their respective ideologies. This resulted in what we now refer to as the Cold War and its associated arms race, with each bloc trying to show that it had the means to retaliate if attacked by the other side. The most important deterrents were nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them efficiently and accurately, which involves intercontinental ballistic missiles. Hence, research into rocketry and missile technology was a major factor on both sides. In many respects, the space race was a cover for an all-out arms race. Over the years, the Cold War finally reached a technological stalemate when the position of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was achieved. You may grin at the acronym MAD, but in short it sums up the position quite well. During the war, Germany had made significant advances in the development of rockets which climaxed with the V-2 powered by liquid ethanol and oxygen. The V-2 rocket is capable of delivering the 1 ton of explosives over a distance of 120 miles on a parabolic trajectory that took it 50 miles above the Earth's surface. It was in essence the first space rocket. At the end of the war, there was a race by the victorious nations to capture the scientists who had developed the V-2 rocket, particularly Wernher von Braun, the scientist in charge of the rocket development. It was the Americans who captured von Braun, took him and a number of his team back to the United States. The Russians likewise captured some of the scientists who had worked on the project, and they also captured a majority of the German rocket hardware. Both sides believing that they would benefit greatly from the expertise of these men and the associated hardware. So began the race to develop more powerful rockets and missiles with a greater range capable of reaching the other's territory carrying an atomic bomb, later to become immensely more powerful nuclear bomb. The distinction between rockets and missiles is that rockets are basically unguided, whereas missiles contain some sort of onboard guidance technology so that they can be accurately directed to specific targets. The Germans could only roughly point a V-2 rocket in the direction of London and give it just enough fuel to reach. Both the US and Russia instigated programs of rocket development with varying amounts of success. The research also concentrated on complex guidance systems, thus increasing the threat to the opposing side as specific targets could then be targeted. The Russians were first to hit the headlines when they launched Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1952. This was the first artificial Earth satellite. Sputnik 1 weighed 100 kilograms and was launched into elliptical low Earth orbit with a maximum height of 583 miles above the Earth's surface. It didn't take the Americans long to realize that the satellite might easily in the future be adapted to carry an atomic or later a nuclear bomb, as technological developments by that time reduced the weight and size of such bombs. This Russian development caught the Americans by total surprise and led to vastly increasing funding for space technology. The result was a hasty formation of NASA in July of 1958. The Cold War dragged on, with each side producing more powerful but physically smaller nuclear weapons and vastly improved delivery systems. In October 1962, an American spy satellite identified Russian missile bases being constructed on the Isle of Cuba, which lies just 90 miles off the Cuban coast of Florida. It was the first real crisis in which two powers had come face to face, and one in which side needed to back down in order to avert a nuclear catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it is now known, lasted just 13 days from 16 to 28 October 1962. The Americans were resolute and imposed a naval blockade around Cuba with the threat to stop and search any vessels heading for Cuba and turn back any carrying weaponry. In the light of this tough response from President Kennedy, the Russians finally agreed to dismantle the Cuban bases and turn around the ships carrying nuclear missiles on board, which were already headed for Cuba. In order for the Russians to save face, the Americans agreed, as part of the deal, to dismantle the nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. This was not a major concession by the USA, as these weapons were due for retirement due to obsolescence. It was perhaps the closest the two sides had ever come to nuclear war. There is a dramatization of this conflict in the movie 13 Days, which provides an excellent summary for what happened in those crucial days. There is an interesting, although a rather conspiratorial view of the Cuban Missile Crisis by the skeptic Hunchbacked. No doubt the Cold War was a time of intense political intrigue, but Hunchbacked suggests that there may have been more collusion between the USA and the USSR that we might at first impressions expect. He goes on to suggest that the Cuban Missile Crisis may not have been as genuine as we were led to believe at the time. He also examines the spy photographs of the evidence of a missile buildup on the Isle of Cuba by the USSR and points out to what he sees as serious anomalies in the evidence presented by the USA of a USSR plot. But for the moment, we'll let that conspiracy theory rest. We have more than enough to deal with already. It was in this atmosphere of the Cold War that the importance of gaining the ability to conquer space took an all-consuming importance. The Russians were seen to be leading the space race with the first successful satellite, the first animal in space, the first man to orbit the Earth, the first spacewalk, and later the first woman in space. Kennedy knew the objective to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth. Kennedy's new objective to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth before the end of the decade took an increased significance and was a clear attempt to project technical superiority. If America could do that, then they would be acknowledged to be ahead in the space race and, as a consequence, be ahead in the more important arms race. It was therefore crucial that NASA could fulfill Kennedy's ambitious objective to put a man on the moon. It had 8 years to accomplish this, which many of the scientists at the time thought would not be achievable. There were many major obstacles ahead, the first of which was the logistics. To take a rocket from Earth directly to the moon and return it safely was quickly rejected as being too difficult due to the massive weights involved, mostly the weight of the fuel required. There were some suggestions put forward by Wernher von Braun to take components of the systems into low Earth orbit using multiple launches and then assemble a moon rocket in space. This again was rejected as being too complex, as there was not then the experience of assembling machines in space, or more realistically doing anything in space. The logistics method finally chosen was dubbed as the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous Approach and was the first suggested by an obscure NASA scientist named Dr. John C. Houbolt. The concept was to build a rocket composed of many pieces and discard the useless weight of each piece when its function is completed. At first, Houbolt was ridiculed for his suggestion and then bitterly opposed by Wernher von Braun himself. He actually instructed Houbolt to forget any crazy idea. Von Braun was in favor of a big rocket approach in which the entire rocket could be sent to the moon and brought back to Earth, which was an impossible idea due to the massive weight needed to be lifted from Earth's gravity. Finally, Houbolt, believing that his approach was the only feasible method, went above von Braun and wrote to the NASA top leadership outlining his case. Eventually and sensibly, Houbolt's logistic method was perceived by NASA not to be one of the several alternatives to achieve the landings on the moon, but the only feasible way. Unfortunately, Houbolt is little known, but without his imagination, his dogged determination and courage to put his job on the line, then there would have been no moon landings or, as the skeptics might interject, no moon fakery. In this approach, the idea was to get the smaller second rocket into Earth orbit using a very large rocket, then using this second smaller rocket to travel to the moon. The second rocket itself was to consist of 3 further rockets, one to propel the combined spacecraft into moon orbit, then a third spacecraft would separate from this mother craft and use its rockets to descend to the moon's surface. This third spacecraft would also consist of 2 spacecrafts closely coupled together, one above the other. The lower spacecraft was the descent stage and was the vehicle for the actual landing on the moon. The upper part was the ascent stage with its own rocket to enable it to escape the moon's gravity for its return to the mother craft still patiently orbiting the moon. The mother craft would then use its rocket a second time to return itself from the moon orbit and into low Earth orbit. Finally, this rocket would be jettisoned and the crew capsule oriented for an entry through the Earth's atmosphere. So, a very complex arrangement working with so many systems, all of which needed to be flawlessly integrated into one gigantic system on the launch pad here on Earth, requiring a rocket of truly immense proportions. The Saturn V rocket was developed for just this purpose. It was huge, being the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket ever brought into operational status, and it still holds records today for the heaviest payload launched and largest payload capacity taken into low Earth orbit, 310,000 pounds. It stood 365 feet high, which would place it 3/4 of the way up Blackpool Tower, which is 518 feet, or for the benefit of our American cousins, 6 stories higher than the Statue of Liberty, being 302 feet, so quite a sizably and totally impressive vehicle. We now have our design, but could NASA build it successfully within the designated time frame set by President Kennedy? That was to be NASA's major challenge in such a limited time scale. So let's take a look at what they did and how they did it. It is the very error of the moon. She comes more near Earth than she was wont, and makes men mad. William Shakespeare, Othello. Now, stepping out of your comfort zone, forsaking all of your little luxuries, and heading for the moon is no trivial endeavor, as it requires a special breed of men to attempt such a perilous journey. Imagine they ask you to be the first man to travel to Mars. I believe that you would need to give it some serious thought over the weekend before you decide. The astronauts, both American and Russian, were indeed brave souls, and many of them paid the price for the ultimate sacrifice in the advancement of man's knowledge of the universe. If there was some fakery by NASA, that should not have been laid at the feet of the astronauts. They may have been ordered in terms of national security, or coerced in some ways we cannot begin to imagine. The Apollo program, Apollo Project, was the third American spaceflight project, the first being Project Mercury and the second Project Gemini. These first 2 projects were concerned with simply putting humans into low Earth orbit, mainly to demonstrate to the Russians that America also had the capability to dominate space. As it transpired, Russia had several notable firsts in space technology, which led to Kennedy's surprise Man on the Moon speech in May 1961 and the subsequent Apollo project. For those of you who are not familiar with the Apollo project, either because you are too young or spent the 1960s and 70s high on magic mushrooms and free love, there is an interesting miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. It is a 12-part HBO television miniseries telling the story of the Apollo project during the 1960s and the early 1970s, which is available on CD. The people at NASA were faced with what some would say was an insurmountable challenge. The task was to really begin from virtually nothing and to design and create a system to reach the moon with manned flight and then return the astronauts safely back to the Earth. All this in the short time span of just 8 years. It should be remembered that this was the 1960s with levels of technology far less advanced than we have today. After all, it is 50 years ago. Now we design systems using advanced computers employing sophisticated software. Back in 1961, they initially used slide rules, which were nothing more than logarithmic tables on a sliding stick. I remember them well with a certain nostalgia and utter confusion. It was at that early stage in my life that I realized I needed to wear glasses to decipher the tiny numbers etched on my slide rule. Apollo was not an insignificant project. It was one of the largest scientific projects ever attempted. According to NASA, it is said to have involved 400,000 people working for a decade. That is a mind-blowing 4 million man-years, a sizable project costing in the region of $25 billion according to NASA, probably around $200 million at present-day values, which was a sizable part of the NASA budget. Now, before some budding mathematician eagerly uses these figures to calculate a ridiculously low annual salary for NASA workers, I need to point out that the figures come from NASA, not me. I can only assume that not everybody worked full-time on this project, so that this must be an excessive overestimate of the man-years, and they also needed to spend more of the cash to buy a few supplies, but it is indicative nonetheless of a sizable scale of the project. The Apollo project initially envisaged $20 million to fulfill the objective of getting a man to the moon and the associated experiments to carry out on the moon. After all, if you could go there, you would need something to occupy your time. This also included bringing back samples of moon rocks and dust for more detailed examination back on Earth. The early Apollo missions were concerned with the design and testing of various system elements required to achieve the goal. Such elements as rocketry payload, vehicle hardware, control systems, telecommunications, life support in space, and all the other associated technology required for this daring adventure into outer space. The numbering of the Apollo missions is somewhat haphazard, at least for my logical mind. However, we will just concentrate on the manned missions. All others were unmanned flights mainly directed toward testing the rocketry and the various system components. For completeness and our more technologically minded readers, I will summarize the individual manned missions together with their launch dates. Apollo 1, 21st February 1967, planned. This mission was never launched due to a fire which erupted in the Apollo Command Service Module (CSM) during a test on the launch pad, destroying the module and tragically killing the 3 astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee. This event caused a serious delay in the Apollo program. This team of astronauts were initially scheduled to be the first men on the moon. Apollo 7, 11 October 1968. This was the first manned Apollo flight and the first manned flight using the Saturn 1B rocket into low Earth orbit. It included the first live TV broadcast from an American spacecraft. Apollo 8, 21st December 1968. The first manned circumlunar flight, and the first manned flight using the Saturn V rocket. The astronaut crew were the first humans to see the far side of the moon and the Earth rise over the lunar horizon. Live television pictures were broadcast to Earth. Apollo 9, 3rd March 1969. During 10 days in Earth orbit, Apollo 9 conducted the first manned test flight of the lunar module, demonstrating its propulsion and ability to rendezvous and dock with the Command Service Module (CSM). An extravehicular activity (EVA) by astronaut Russell L. Schweickart tested the portable life support system. Apollo 10, 18 May 1969. In this dress rehearsal for the lunar landing, Apollo 10's lunar module was flown manned around the moon and descended to within 8.4 nautical miles of the lunar surface without landing. Apollo 11, 16 July 1969. The Apollo 11 lunar module performed the first manned landing on the moon in the Sea of Tranquility, overcoming navigation errors and several computer alarms. Neil Armstrong was the first man to ever step foot on the moon and issue those now famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," broadcast worldwide on live TV. Astronaut Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin performed a single extravehicular activity (EVA) in the direct vicinity of the LM. The amazing Apollo 11 moon landing can be seen in grainy black and white in the Apollo Flight Journal. It may be interesting to note that the world's TV stations were not allowed the live feed of the television broadcast, but only allowed to refilm the event from a large projection screen, which made the television even more grainy and rather indicadent. Apollo 12, 14 November 1969. Apollo 12 performed the first precise manned landing on the moon in the ocean of storms near the Surveyor 3 probe. In the two EVAs, the astronauts recovered portions of the Surveyor and returned them to Earth. First controlled lunar module LM ascent stage impact into the moon after jettison. First use of deployable S-band antenna, the lunar TV camera was damaged by accidental exposure to the sun. Apollo 13, 11 April 1970. Apollo 13 was intended to land at Frau Moreau. Apollo 13's mission was aborted after a service module oxygen tank explosion on the trip to the moon, causing the landing to be cancelled. The LM was used as a crew lifeboat for a single loop around the moon and an eventual safe return to the Earth. Subsequently, the plot line for this movie, Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks. Apollo 14, 31 January 1971. After docking problems, a faulty LM abort switch, and delaying landing radar acquisition, Apollo 14's LM landed successfully at Frau Moreau. First color video images from the surface of the moon, first materials science experiments in space, and two EVAs. Apollo 15, 26 July 1971. Landing at Hadley Apennine, it involved a 3-day lunar stay and extensive geology investigations. First use of the lunar roving vehicle, driving 17.25 miles, 1 lunar stand-up EVA, 3 lunar surface EVAs, and a deep space EVA on return, retrieving the orbital camera film from the service module SM. Apollo 16, 16 April 1972. After a malfunction in the yaw gimbal servo, looping the command service module CSM, the landing was delayed and the CSM time in lunar orbit was reduced. Apollo 16's LM landed in the Descartes Highlands. No ascent stage deorbit due to malfunction, 3 lunar EVAs, and a deep space EVA. Apollo 17, 7 December 1972. The final Apollo lunar mission landed at Taurus-Littrow. Schmidt, a geologist, was the first professional scientist to go on a NASA mission, and on the first night launch, 3 lunar EVAs and 1 deep space EVA, the last manned spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit. Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20. These missions were cancelled as previously mentioned. There have been no missions by any nation outside Earth's lower orbit since Apollo. I cannot prevent myself from adding my own little footnote here. The Apollo 11 astronauts ceremoniously unveiled a plaque with the words,
"Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind."
This plaque was then attached to the leg of the descent stage of the lunar lander, which would remain on the moon. When I first saw this on television back in 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, I thought that they may also have added, "But we cannot stay long as we need to return to Earth to bomb the hell out of a tiny country we call Cambodia." It seems that Peace for All Mankind had a few notable exceptions in 1969. Sorry, I did keep this patiently to myself for the past 50 years. Now our question is, did all this really happen as depicted by NASA? We and almost the whole world watched most of it live on television, so much so that many became bored with seeing men in white spacesuits bobbing up and down in some gray, dusty landscape. In fact, the first 50 Shades of Grey. There was nothing, as we had discovered, remotely exciting on the moon. Of course, it was a major achievement, but the moon had little to capture the long-term imagination of common man. Starting with the idea that they should fake the moon landings, they finally concluded that it should be more cost-effective to actually send men to the moon rather than fake it. So did it happen as described? Our skeptics will answer with a resounding no, but our believers would forcibly say yes. Let's now take a quick look at the major protagonist in our story and listen to what they have to say on the subject. Uneasy Bedfellows. Now for conspiracy, I know how it tastes, though it be dished for me to try how. William Shakespeare, The Winter's Tale. The Skeptics. I would now like to digress in order to introduce our main moon hoax advocates, our merry band of protagonists collectively known as our skeptics. After all, it is due to them that we have this video to watch, so our thanks to them. Please note that my list is in no way exhaustive, as there are many, many more who have expressed doubts about the Apollo missions and countless more who have steadfastly defended NASA. But my list does cover just about all the theories concerning the anomalies suggested in the moon landing saga. One word of caution: this subject is a minefield of fakery, deception, lies, deceit, and the occasional morsel of truth. At least that is how it appears to me. There are also many false trails, dead ends, wrong turnings, hidden facts, concealed avenues that is often hard to know what aspect to examine next. I have tried as far as possible to be fair and equal in my treatment of the skeptics and the believers alike. At the beginning, I determined myself not to have any opinions on the matter, but simply present the evidence from both partisan sides. It is not an easy task to appear to be impartial, and I'm sure at times I may get it wrong, make errors, miss some relevant evidence, place greater emphasis on one side or the other, but that is human failing. As I reveal more and more of the evidence, I feel sometimes pulled one way then another. At those times I get up and go for a walk in the garden and contemplate my miserable government pension. Reality turns at lightning speed. The number of actors in our story is large and the arena of evidence is vast, so I have, of necessity, needed to be selective. In doing this, I have tried to present a fair, balanced, and I trust an equal-handed approach to the presentation and the evidence and counter-evidence. I'm absolutely sure that I will have got it wrong in some areas, but the subject is very complex, so I can only apologize at the outset for any imperfections. As I pointed out at the beginning, there are, on the internet, over 11 million separate submissions to this subject, and I confess that I have not yet quite read them all. I offer my skeptics in no particular order, except that I will introduce someone who many believe to be the major catalyst of this whole enigma, often referred to as the grandfather of the moon hoax conspirators, the late Bill Kaysing. Bill Kaysing, 1922 to 2005. Bill Kaysing worked as a senior technical writer, 1956 to 1963, for Rocketdyne, a major division of Rockwell International. Rocketdyne were involved in the several NASA mission developments, including the development of the Saturn V rocket. He was not a trained engineer nor a scientist, but imagine he was on the periphery of some major hoax. Even before July 1969, he had what he described as a hunch, an intuition, a true conviction. Serious doubts about the various aspects of the Apollo project. He self-published a book in 1976, We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle, which was later republished in 2002 by Health Research Books. Unfortunately, this copy of his book is a scanned copy and a little difficult to read. The book itself is listed on Amazon at the princely price of $433.75. All copies shown for sale on the internet are priced above £450, so better you struggle with my scanned edition. In his book, he introduced the main conspiracy ideas that have been subsequently developed and added to by other skeptics. He claims that the chance of a successful manned landing on the moon was calculated to be 0.0017%, a somewhat surprisingly precise calculation. He maintained that it would have been easier for NASA to fake the moon landings than to really go there. He was interviewed by Bart Sibrel. Bart Sibrel, 1964. Our next skeptic is Bart Sibrel, an ex-NBC journalist and filmmaker, but best known as an evangelistic moon hoax investigator. Sibrel is undoubtedly the most vociferous and crusading of our skeptics. He has directed 4 films on the subject of the moon landings, perhaps more famously a 2001 film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which examines the evidence for a moon landing hoax. We will examine this video in more detail later in this video. One of Sibrel's major pieces of what he claims is definite evidence that the moon landings were faked concerns the famous shot of the Earth from 130,000 miles out, supposedly taken by the astronauts from the command module. Sibrel had said that the Earth view in the shot covered in his film was made through the use of a transparency of the Earth. The arguments that Sibrel puts forward in his film have been challenged by many sources, including the Spectre Studios' 5-part video series Lunar Legacy, which aims to disprove the documentary's main argument that the Apollo crew faked their distance from the Earth while in low Earth orbit. For many years, he confronted most of the Apollo moon astronauts, brandishing a Bible and repeatedly asking each to swear on the Bible that they had been on the moon. The majority refused, except I believe 3. Sabrell was famously punched in the face by the astronaut Buzz Aldrin after Sabrell confronted Aldrin with his theories and accused the former astronaut of being a coward and a liar and a thief. Sabrell often appears on talk radio shows. Marcus Allen. Marcus Allen is the British distributor and publisher of the UK version of Nexus, a bi-monthly alternative news magazine. Allen worked as a photographer in London in the 1960s and has used his professional expertise to critically examine the NASA Apollo photographs. Allen claims that many of the photographs taken during the Apollo missions have serious anomalies which he contends are evidence of faking. He has given many public presentations and uploading videos to YouTube on the subject of the moon landings. He contends that getting unmanned spacecraft to the moon is not a great problem, but including humans in the cargo is a major problem due to the radiation levels outside of the protective umbrella of the Earth's magnetosphere. He suggests that NASA might have possibly sent robot missions because radiation levels in outer space would almost certainly prove deadly to humans, a view shared by many others as we shall see.